Debra Wake is our presenter. She's a member of the American Rosie the Riveter Association. She has written numerous articles about Rosie and the American home front during World War II. Debra retired as a manager of youth, family, and camp programs for the Henry Ford Museum, Greenfield Village, which now collectively is called the Henry Ford. She relocated to Holland in 2020 and served as the volunteer coordinator at the Holland Museum for the past 2 years. Debra received her BA in history from the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Please welcome Debra Wake.
Thank you, Fran. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me today to talk about a topic I'm very passionate about, the working women of World War II. As most of you know, Rosie is actually a symbol for all the millions of women that worked in non-traditional roles during World War II. But before we talk about Rosie, I'd like to briefly review what led up to our entrance into World War II, and we'll see if I get this right. No. Wizard Dave. You can do it. I know I can do it. The arrow's not working and that's not working. Okay. That's the one thing we didn't do is we made sure it came up and then we didn't make sure it advanced. All right. Well, we'll catch up. It won't advance. Thank you very much. Yay! Amy, you did it. Okay, so by the mid-1930s, we were deep in the Great Depression, and Michigan was especially hit hard. Detroit was actually the fourth largest city in the country, basically due to the auto and its related industries. And during the Depression, hundreds of thousands of men lost their jobs. But it wasn't just the men that were targeted. Hoover signed a law for the Economy Act of 1932, and Section 213 stipulated that if a married couple both worked for the government, whether it was state or federal level, one lost their job, and they weren't allowed to both work for the government. And we know who lost their job. So soon, private sector businesses, public schools started to follow suit. And it was really unacceptable for a married woman to work outside of the home, both socially and, politically until World War II. Then in March of 33, FDR was inaugurated. It begins the New Deal with his alphabet of Relief, Recovery, and Reform Acts. September 1st, Hitler invades Poland, begins his march through Europe, and Britain and France declare war. August 1st, Japan invades French Indochina, which prompts FDR to start a partial embargo on oil, gas, and metals to Japan. So Japan had to start looking for another source. And of course, one of those was the rich Dutch Indies. And the only thing that stood between Japan and the Dutch Indies was the American-controlled Philippines and Pearl Harbor. So I think that's very important. September 16th, we had our first peacetime draft. Men between the ages of 21 and 45 were required to register. Those selected served for only a year until we entered the war. And then, of course, the terms were extended. And by 1945, approximately 50 men were registered and 50 million men were registered and 16 million men served. September 24th, 1940, Axis powers signed the Berlin Act. So the Axis countries got together. December 29th, 1940, FDR begins his fireside, or in one of his fireside chats, he talks about how America must become the arsenal of democracy, selling planes and other war materials to Britain and their allies. January 6th, he goes to to Congress and declares the 4 essential human freedoms. And I find that I talk about that later on, that, FDR, had these concepts and people really didn't understand until Rockwell started publishing his images, his interpretation of what these 4 freedoms were. And that later on became a war bonds tour that made millions of dollars. January 10th of 1941, FDR announces the start of the Lend-Lease program, dispersing not only war equipment, but also clothing, food, medicines, and we truly did become the arsenal of democracy and the food basket of democracy. Then it all changed. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. In a matter of 2 hours, 2,400 people were killed, or Americans were killed or injured. I've got the listing of the boats and the ships and the planes. It was just a call to arms. FDR, the famous, day that will go down in infamy. After that, we went to war and we produced more materials. And I am there. Okay, sorry. So now, introducing Rosie the Riveter. So, how many of you have heard of the song, Rosie the Riveter? You heard me sing all the day long, whether rain or shine. She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie the Riveter. And I didn't roll the R's like I'm supposed to because I never learned to do that. But that was written by Evans and Loeb in 1932, and that is the first mention of Rosie the Riveter. Norman Rockwell heard the song and was inspired to create his own piece of art that appeared on the cover of Saturday Evening Post, Memorial Day, 1943. This is the image, the one on the post on the upper right side. That is the image Americans knew as Rosie the Riveter. She's got her name on her lunchbox. She's got her foot on Mein Kampf, but she still, looks determined, but she's got a powder puff in her pocket. She's got the red lipstick on. They say that Hitler hated makeup. He wanted his women fresh-faced. So, of course, Rosie probably wore her red lipstick. But notice the similarities. He kind of borrowed a pose from his prophet Isaiah from the Sistine Chapel and added, the female power behind it. So people go, well, what happened to this image? Why is this not the image we all know today as we can do it? And that's because of the copyrights. The Rockwell Foundation had a lot of copyrights and that image kind of disappeared. So J. Howard Miller's image is what we know today as Rosie the Riveter, We Can Do It. And he was simply a Pittsburgh graphic artist that was hired by the Westinghouse Company to create a series of posters that was only appeared in Westinghouse factories. So this poster appeared for 10 weeks for employees only, and then it was gone. So people didn't see this image during the war. But it reappeared in 1982. The Washington Post was actually doing a piece on war propaganda. And they found this image and it was soon embraced by, the feminist movement. But it's interesting if you talk to any of the original Rosies that are still alive today, they get kind of upset. It's not about empowerment. It was not about empowerment to them. And I get all emotional. They want to bring their loved ones home. They want to end the war. Sorry. So that is the true meaning to them. Then recruiting women. How did they recruit these Rosies? And so there was a department in the government, Office of War Information and the War Manpower Commission, who were put together to recruit a new workforce, and namely women. Now, the first wave of women was actually pretty easy for them to enlist. These women already working at low-paying jobs, traditional female jobs, and they were willing to come in, for a higher rate of pay. Unfortunately, it meant that a lot of beauty salons and cafes went out of business because they all left for higher paying jobs in the factory. The second wave were relatively easy. These were the girls, the high school girls graduating, who would have found a temporary secretarial job or teaching job before they started college. So this was something that they could move into easily as well. It was the third wave that was the difficult. This was the married women. You know, remember how I said it was not socially acceptable. So society had to change its way of thinking to, assure these women it was okay for them to roll up their sleeves and go into these factory jobs and other jobs. But it was the husbands that really gave the pushback. They said that only 1 in 10 of the married men were actually in service. A lot of them were working in essential jobs. Both my grandfathers worked, in essential jobs here in the States, and they didn't want their wives working outside of the home. So in 43, the magazine The Nation published an article, and it was entitled America's Pampered Husbands. And there was a line in there that says, if a woman can learn to operate a drill press, a husband should be able to learn to operate a washing machine. So they finally shamed the husbands into letting the women come into the workplace. And by the end of the war, there were at least 6 million women working in the factories and millions more working in agriculture and other jobs traditionally, covered by the men who were off to war. But remember, there was a caveat. The caveat was that no matter how good you are, how dedicated, how hard you work, when the war is over, you're done. You're going to go back to your aprons and your brooms and your children. You're going to go back to your traditional lives, because that's what the men are fighting for. Now, those departments also sent memorandums and directives to print, Hollywood, radio, trying to get the word out. It is your job to convince these women it is their patriotic duty to go in and enter the workforce. So there's a lot of ads here that you see, all showing these strong, able women able to do this. And if you didn't know whether you had the skills or not, Women's Day magazine actually published a quiz. Can you follow a pattern? Do you like jigsaw puzzles? Where do you fit in? There is a job for everybody, young or old. There was a job for you. So I love that. They also got the comic books. Wow, there were so many female superheroes that were created during World War II. And my favorite was Mary Marvel, not to be confused with Captain Marvel. Mary Marvel was a superhero. And in one of the comic books, she got a job with Western Union. She was just going to deliver telegrams, because every job needed to be filled. And of course, she went on, because she's a superhero, went on to save everybody that she delivered telegrams to. But they were going to hit you at every level. My favorite is the bottom right. It's Adele. Adele made airplane parts for the war. And I know you can't read it, so I'm going to read this. It says, "Mother, is your job at Adele important?" "Yes, dear. Any job in the least way assisting our fighting men is important. Mother's working harder than she ever did before, putting more and more salary into war bonds because she knows how much there is at stake." Remember that ad. So even today, this is considered the most successful propaganda campaign in U.S. advertising history. We can do it. So Rosie in the workforce. Although Rosie's soon found that they could roll up their sleeves and do many of the jobs previously only done by men, they they were in all facets of running the country. Nancy Harkness Love is the upper left-hand picture. She actually started a ferrying squad long before the WASP she put together some already trained pilots and they started ferrying airplanes. And there was one out of Metro Airport, or well, Romulus, that became Metro Airport. They delivered the milk. They worked the railroads. They were the barbers. They were the mailmen. They were the farmers. It wasn't just the factories. They kept the country running. But they faced obstacles. Although millions of women entered the workforce, whether financial gain or patriotic duty, they faced many obstacles. First, they encountered hostility from their employers, who really didn't want to hire these women, but they knew that with the government contracts they had, that they could not possibly fulfill the contracts with the dwindling male population of workers. Then initially there was hostility from their coworkers, those essential workers that were still in the workforce would possibly pull pranks or take long breaks, so the women had to do additional work or use foul language to make them uncomfortable. And so I just read in A.J. Bam's book called Arsenal of Democracy. And he says that the supervisors put up these signs saying, "Men, please watch your language. There are ladies present." And after a couple weeks, the managers started putting their own signs up going, "Women, please watch your language. There are men present." He said he heard words come out of their mouths he'd never heard before. Another challenge was that a lot of these women left their hometowns, left the country or left their towns to go into big cities where they could get jobs in factories. That resulted in a housing shortage. So where did these women live when they got there? There were terrible rumors of them having to share a bed and just swap out, each shift. But it was even worse if they had children. What do you do with the children? The World War II actually permanently altered society's ideas about childcare. And for the first time, the government got involved in childcare. The Landum Act, which was an act designed to help new cities, growing cities, deal with water, housing, and other shortages. They got into the daycare business. They provided, I think it's, what is it today? Over $1 trillion in daycare to build over 3,000 daycare centers that provided daycare to hundreds of thousands of children. But it wasn't enough. And if you were African American, you didn't qualify for those daycare centers at all. So there were a lot of companies, and I haven't been able to find any around here, but I know Kaiser, who was a shipbuilder on the West Coast, they had their own daycare centers. And these daycare centers were all operated 24 hours a day. So they had 3 shifts covered. They offered the children education, naps, hot meals. And when the mothers picked them up, they had a hot meal to take home with them so that the women did not have to worry about cooking when they got home. They had the highest production rate during the war and didn't lose the attrition that other companies did, because these women either couldn't find any place to live or anybody to take care of their children, and they had to leave. They had to go back home where they had family that could watch their children. So it was a whole new time. But the other challenge was, remember, ladies, you're still a woman. Manuals and training films reminded women, actually sometimes insulting women, if a hairnet is not your ideal method of keeping your hair out of heavy machinery, put on an attractive turban. And we certainly would not be women if we weren't concerned about our weight. So eat a healthy meal to avoid injury at the job. These manuals suggested that women were so hung up on their physical appearance that they wouldn't follow safety procedures. But really the emphasis on beauty really went back to the whole society idea that, when this job is over, this is temporary. When this job is over, you're going back to your role as a housewife and, a mother and a wife. So being attractive is your primary function. In here, you'll see some pictures. There's Veronica Lake, doing her part. This was in a magazine showing, your hair, long hair could get caught in machinery. And then they suggested the victory roll or banana curls or something that would work really well in the front so you could wear your bandana. The victory red lipstick. And I love the one at the bottom. And please, no tight sweaters. So this is telling me that they were worried about distracting the male workers. So now not only are we required to watch our safety, we have to look out for the safety of the men. During the war was, it was the first time women really were seen wearing trousers. And it wasn't until at least a year after we had entered the war that women's size boots, steel toe boots became available. So you were wearing, your brother's or, the smallest boot you could find to be safe on the workplace. And I love the birdhouse. This is actually an ad from Alaska saying, hey, this birdhouse is available to rent until the spring when the birds arrive. Because they were living, wherever they could, chicken coops, trailers, tents. And the childcare, there were terrible rumors of children being left locked in the car, or they would have a younger child watching an infant at home so the mother could go to work. So it was just terrible, terrible times, lots going on. Not that today we don't have a lot going on, but yeah, lots going on. So changes on the home front. Now, I'm just going to briefly glance over this because there's so much. As I told Fran, I do another whole presentation just on what's going on the home front. But there's scrap drives where we're trying to collect materials. And in Holland, we actually melted down donated Civil War cannon and cannonballs, and they tore up the old interurban tracks in order to melt it down as part of this scrap drive. Victory gardens were planted everywhere. Michigan had 400,000 victory gardens in Michigan alone. Food rationing, of course, we need to be able to send food overseas to our servicemen and women. So we had to try to grow as much as we could, and you could only buy so much. So I'm just thinking of these women who are working. You got to get your ration coupons. You have to figure out the menu to figure out how you can plan a meal from the infants on up, and then get to the different stores. And my dad was telling me stories about, you went to the meat market, and then when you went to the fruit stand. And so he'd stand in one line at a store while his mother was at another store, and hoping she'd get back in time when it was his turn to get up front. Just mind-boggling to me. Non-food ration items. One of the first items that was rationed was tires. We had no supply of rubber because that was under Japanese control. So they lowered the speed limit, not because we didn't have fuel, but because we didn't have rubber and they didn't want you to wear out your tires. So there was a victory speed. And then, of course, war bonds. So much about war bonds. How many of you have seen the video about we bought a bomber? Oh, well, I'll have to come back. There was not only could businesses buy war bonds and you could invest some of your paycheck, but you could also get neighborhoods and school children involved in raising money and getting people to buy bonds and actually purchase a tank or a Jeep or a bomber. And Grand Rapids South High School did that. So it's very cool. There's so many stories. The Hollywood stars came out and made bond drives, as well as Norman Rockwell made, I want to say $16 million because he went around with the original Four Freedoms paintings and people wanted to meet the artist. Just so much was going on. So total production. This is just an idea of everything as far as war materials, but this doesn't talk about, everything else, not only the food, but in Michigan, Kellogg's, the women that worked at Kellogg's packaged food rations that were sent overseas. The Rosies in Tecumseh, Michigan, that worked for Herd Lock made millions of padlocks. You had to lock the foot lockers that the servicemen and women took their belongings over in. In Adrian, the Michigan Producers Dairy Company made dried milk and butter that went overseas. Van de Kamp, Heinz pickle, all of these other things that you don't think about that were needed to win the war. So what did we do here in Holland? So we have, trying to look, upper left is Holland Furnace. That is advertisement. They made armor plating that went to cover tanks as well as anchor chains. And so they actually hired women there. The Hart and Cooley, the newsletter called The Register was Hart and Cooley. They switched over from making heat registers to 60mm shell casings. And they actually earned the E Award. The E Award is given to all employees who meet certain production levels and there's no strikes and all kinds of, exciting, accomplishments. You get this E Award. And that leads me to Fana Doctor. Fana Doctor worked at Hart and Cooley, and she was the first woman hired there. So when they were presented with their E Award, she was the first one to receive it. And she was able to speak at the ceremony, talking about the contributions of the women there. And there was a mural on the back of, what's the name of the paint company? Reptolite. There's a mural of some Rosie the Riveters, and it's in honor of her that was created by Jessica Miller. So that's very exciting. Yes, that's the one in the middle. We also have Fafner Folks talks about all the, they had bowling leagues and their newsletters talked about birthday celebrations and if someone was left to have a baby. I mean, it was a very close-knit group of workers. On the far left, what's that one there? I'm trying to see this one. Oh, that's the awards here, Mike. Okay, so the shoes, the Holland Racine Shoe Company, that is the bronze 1 millionth pair of shoes that they made. In January of 42, they were awarded a contract to make 130,000 pairs of shoes. And they were the first company to receive the Bullseye Award. The Bullseye Award is if you get 100% of your workforce to donate 10% of their paycheck to war bonds. And so they were the first to receive that. And then in August of 44, they had to send out an appeal to the residents of Holland because they got another contract and they needed immediately 60,000 more pairs of shoes. And they needed them on the battlefront. So workers came in, they got them packaged in waterproof cases. So if the sea was rough, they could just dump them overboard and they would float to the shores to the fighting men who needed them. Another was Chris Craft. And I don't have a worker's picture here, but I did just find one last week before I left. I found a woman, her name was Jeanette Coops, and she worked at the Chris Craft in Holland. And of course, Chris Craft made more landing craft for the D-Day invasion than any other company. So we can be very proud of that. So I was glad to see that I could finally find a woman. I had talked to the son of a Rosie, that her and her sister both worked at the Chris Craft in Cadillac, but I had not been able to find the Holland connection yet. So still researching. And then finally, the bottom right is H.L. Freeland. They actually had 90% of their workforce was women, and they sewed the pea coats and the field jackets. And a Rosie named Hazel Broach recalled the needles, it's so hot, they'd be red hot. And if they ran a needle through their hand accidentally, all they did was go to the office, the secretary, they would splash some, rubbing alcohol on it, and they would go back to work. They were working 10 to 12-hour days and made millions of coverings for the fighting men. So just amazing. And I'm still researching in other areas of West Michigan. So we have Truscott and St. Joseph at the uh, upper and middle left. That is the women. The middle is the knockdown kit of the boat they built. And the upper left is they're standing in their dress uniforms in front of the boat that they built. So Truscott was the only boat builder to really hire and train large numbers of women. And they did, they had a knockdown kit already built. They just had to assemble it. Berkey and Gay, you'll see a picture in the center of the furniture company in Grand Rapids. They were advertising for women workers as well. And they, of course, made, airplane parts. We had so many furniture makers in this side of the state that, of course, transferred over to making spears and rods and things for airplanes. In Grand Haven, there was a Peerless Glove Company. Women created dress gloves and work gloves for all branches of the military. Camfield Manufacturing made radar antennas and nozzles, which are the plastic hoods. The women made those. Continental Motors in Muskegon, that's the upper right hand. You can't see, but in the back, there's one woman there. But there were several major companies in Muskegon, Brunswick, Norge, Steel Tower, Hayden, and many more that hired large quantities of women. And today, if you go up to Muskegon, they call themselves the Arsenal of Democracy. If you get to Muskegon right now, they just opened up last week before, a new exhibit about World War II in Muskegon. It's fascinating. In Kalamazoo, the Kalamazoo Stove Museum, the women, that's the center middle, were packing parachutes that were going to hold flares. And so they're packing them into the cylinders. And then, of course, another Kalamazoo company, the lower left side, Gibson Guitar. Love this story. I actually have a book out there about it. They hired women to, create the wiring for airplanes and the wood parts for airplanes. And they claim they did not manufacture any guitars, because who would want a guitar built by a woman? They discovered later on that, if you find a guitar now, pay a lot of money, it has a banner, and that was built during World War II and probably made by a woman. So I think that's just fascinating. So I'm doing so much research right now because I know there's so many more stories out there, and we are losing our Rosie so quickly. And unfortunately, a lot of these ladies just went back to work and didn't share their stories with their families. So it was what we had to do, and we moved on. So it's harder, to get the stories than from a lot of the American veterans. But where did Rosie go? By 1945, the female workforce had grown to approximately 20 million, including war-related jobs, as well as agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, and many, many more. 1 out of every 4 married women had entered the workforce. Female employment in defense industries had grown by 462% between 1940 and 1944. And by 1944, women held 1/3 of all the manufacturing jobs in the country. Polls indicate that 61 to 85% of the working women wanted to keep their jobs after the war, and over half of those were married women. So what happened to Rosie? So the Office of War Information in the private sector began a new campaign, and it was nicknamed Operation June Cleaver. Overnight, the ads and billboards that had previously encouraged women that they can do it disappeared and was replaced by ads by these. So I love these. Oh, the bottom right or bottom left. You mean a woman can open this ketchup bottle? Or upper left. Oh, I don't wear the pants, but I buy them. It was the idea of the, servicemen came back and you were going to go back into your previous lives, get married, have babies. But my favorite is that the new Adele ad. Mother, when will you stay home again? Some jubilant day, mother will stay home again, doing the job she likes best, making a home for you and um, your dad when he gets back. The problem is that a lot of men didn't come back. And a lot of women needed those jobs. And a lot of women wanted that job. They discovered the new independence. So even though they had done it to end the war and bring home the servicemen, um, you know, they didn't necessarily want to give up that newfound skill and independence. So in 2017, the US Congress passed a resolution making March 21st, which is coming up in 10 days, National Rosie the Riveter Day. Last year on National Rosie the Riveter Day, I spoke at the Holland Museum. Then in 2020, the Rosie the Riveter National Congressional Medal of Honor Act was signed. And then we had COVID. So April 10th of last year, they had they had an award ceremony and symbolically awarded all the Rosies, the millions of women, the Congressional Medal of Honor. I was able to attend. I was invited to attend. And they had 24 original Rosies, as you can see in the photo. Ages between 85 and 106 were there. One of the ladies was getting ready to turn 107. Unfortunately, millions of these strong and amazing women, I say they have moxie. These women had moxie. So many of them were not here to receive that award in person and receive the acknowledgement that they deserved. But myself and others will continue to preserve and share their stories, honoring the women who didn't say, we can do it. They just went out and did it. So this is two Rosies, your two Rosies here in Holland. Maxine Boving actually was born and raised in the area. She went out to Seattle and worked in the shipping industry, or building ships during the war, but came back here. She lives over near Jackie's, or former Jackie's. And Sylvia Tanis. Sylvia actually worked at the Willow Run bomber plant, and she is so little. Part of her job was that they would put her in a harness and lower her into the wing parts to do, the bucking and the riveting. She just a little Spitfire, and she moved here. She met a man that had come to Detroit to enlist, and they met at a movie theater while he was waiting to be shipped out. So they communicated, and when she would come here to visit him before they married, her mother would always come with her, of course. She has fascinating stories of courage and fortitude, just amazing. So I want to thank you, but I do have, for those who weren't able to see the artifacts that I brought, I do have a couple slides. So of course, WOW stands for Women Ordnance Workers. This was the women specifically who made the bombs and the tanks, the ordnance. We also said, this was the chapter I belonged to, we called them wonderful, outstanding women. So I have a few artifacts out here. I actually did rivet. There's a rivet gun sitting out there. If you want to pick that up, please do. It weighs a lot, and now you understand why she's flexing muscles. I cannot imagine, lifting that thing for the day. But the piece behind it is a piece that I riveted. And look on the back, it does not look pretty. So it took a lot of skill for these women. And the red piece with the little flat, that's the bucking bar. I don't know if you've ever seen riveting, but it's actually like a fastener. You put it in and you fasten it and it keeps two things together. But what they did was that they had like this flat bolt, and you drove it into this flat part and smashed the outside so that it kept the panels together. And, when your loved one might be on that plane or on that ship, you're going to make sure that you rivet the best you can. I don't have a life jacket, and I tell the story in my other presentation, but milkweed was found to be a substitute for the material used in life jackets that we'd previously gotten from Japan. We became the headquarters, Petoskey became the processing headquarters for all the milkweed that was gathered in this whole side of the country. And there was an inspector, a woman inspector at one of these factories that made the life jackets, and her son had to bail out of a plane and float around with his life jacket for a while. And when he got back, they found her inspection stamp was in that life jacket. So she had literally saved her son. Well, so just stories galore. Some of the makeup, I've got some ads, and the curlers are out there. They do still make that victory red lipstick that, Hitler abhorred. I have some buttons, and there's actually, when you received your e-pen, it came with this little envelope and this little letter of thanks and signed by FDR. Next to that is a little pen with wings, and that is your bullseye pen. If you donated money through your check, you received that as well. And my WoW comic book with Mary Marvel. There's so many, the music and the CDs, they're out there, it's not, the story still needs to be told. We were just talking about a play that was put on out at the Purple Rose Theater in Chelsea. A play was written about the Willow Run Bomber Plant and the Rosies out there and everything that happened to them. And, that should become a movie. I mean, Tom Hanks is doing all these other military movies. We need to get him to do a Rosie story. Yes. Just some pictures from the ceremony that I attended. And that's it. So this is my other presentation. These are all things that were happening, and there's much more, I'm sure, but these are just things that have either a local connection or a whole family connection to Holland. That just so many changes on the home front. My favorite is the upper right. My girlfriend actually has a blackout kit that someone gave her. It was a box, and it came with fabric that you could cover your windows to black them out during air raid drills. And then it came with games for the kids to keep them entertained and some other things. Just fascinating. So that is my presentation. I want to thank everyone. Just remember, we wouldn't be where we were today, and we wouldn't be as successful as we are today if the women hadn't stepped up and done what needed to be done. And so our American veterans, I love them dearly, and many gave the ultimate sacrifice, but many of these women did extraordinary things too. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, wait till I come around with the microphone.
Deb, I just want to acknowledge, in my 20 plus years of being a docent at the Holland Museum, there has never been anyone who has had your energy, your enthusiasm, your creativity. You have just been such a blessing. And I know that once you're Rosie, you might be going on the road, might be watching you on TV or in so on, but I just wanted to thank you.
Oh,
And,
thank you, Jay.
And I will try to find, Dan Coops was in my high school graduating class. So I will find out if it was his mother or someone, an aunt or someone. So
That would be great. Yes, if anyone has any connections to someone who worked here in Holland, please let me know. I want stories either firsthand or secondhand, whatever you can provide. Because I have a list of all of the factories and companies, paint companies and so on that got war contracts, but I don't know necessarily that they hired women or what those women did in the company. So,
Other questions?
No?
What were some of the things produced in the Detroit area? Because
And,
I
oh,
know-
in the Detroit area, they made helmets, everything from, the helmets and the packing, the parachutes. Another thing that we rationed was our silk nylons. And we talk about that. It's like they'd only been around for about a year. I think they'd sold 60 million pairs and then they were taken away. But they were needed for the silk bags for putting, bomb materials in and so on. But, the auto industry, of course, William Knudsen was brought in to head up the, get all of the auto industry and related industries to switch over to war materials. So they made everything. If you've been up north, there's charcoal briquettes. Kingsford. I mean, in that area, they were making gliders, the wood gliders that they would, put Jeeps into and people into, and they would pull them by plane and then they would just glide into enemy territory. I can't imagine that job. It's just, oh,
Where? Oh, there.
okay, she's bringing the microphone.
I see milkweed processing in Petoskey.
Mhm.
What was that about?
Well, the milkweed, as I mentioned, they were making life jackets, but the materials they had put in the life jackets came from Japan. And so a scientist in Chicago actually was testing all these different materials and found the milkweed worked. So some of the youngest Rosies that came to the Congressional Medal of Honor Award actually were kids. Their job was to go out and pick milkweed. And it took millions of pounds of milkweed to make, one life jacket. Because that's, in fact, I just bought some milkweed. So you can try it. It's so light, and you just pick this little bit of silk out of a plant. And so to make enough life jackets that they needed, every school child, every camp group, every classroom went out all over the Midwest and East Coast, basically. This is milkweed country, to pick milkweed, and they would send it all up to Petoskey, and they had these huge drying warehouses where they just hung these bags of milkweed to be processed. So I know that there was one in Allegan County. That's the location that actually sent POWs to Heinz factory, and local farmers could get them as well, because we had a lot of farms in this area. These were, the POWs were interviewed. If they felt that they were not really passionate about Hitler, they would send them here. If they were really strongly influenced, they were sent elsewhere. So they were relatively safe. The book out there talks about a gentleman who actually, when the guard had to take his break, this POW was in charge. And they wouldn't really pay them in money. They gave them some credit, and they were able to buy chocolate or cigarettes or something in their little store. So they were compensated. Otherwise they would just sit there. And I know at Heinz, they made, a lot of them were woodworkers, and they made the barrels for the pickles and so on, vinegar.
Along that line, there is a book written by, I believe she's from Hudsonville, and it's called Enemies in the Orchard.
Oh, yes.
And it's a wonderful book, easy reading, and tells about the farm and when the POWs came from Allegan to work on the farm.
Yeah, when on my side of the state, we had Fort Wayne, and that had been an induction center, but then they brought the Italian prisoners of war over. And there's so many stories about the girls going to the gates and flirting with these prisoners of war. And of course, all prisoners were required to be sent back to Europe. And many of them came back over and married these girls. So,
Got a question back here.
oh, yes,
Virtual.
Jack.
How many
Dave.
POWs stayed in Michigan?
Oh, I don't have those stats with me. That's in my other presentation. Sorry. I know it had to be tens of thousands because there were many camps in Michigan, not just Camp Allegan. But I really couldn't tell you. I just know that most, if not all, the ones in Michigan were German. There were not Japanese prisoners of war sent to Michigan. They were sent elsewhere. Yes.
I was taken with that poster that you showed a picture of. Women are humans too.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
But I also, it made me think that has been reconstituted into Black Lives Matter.
Right, right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was part of a training manual. I actually printed off the whole pages. This was done by RCA Radio. So there's a page that says women are teachable. Make clear their part in the process. Allow for their lack of familiarity with machine processes. See that her work set is comfortable, safe, and convenient. I mean, and then there's women are cooperative. If you just explain what they need to do, women, be paid. It just goes on and on. It's so, but eventually a lot of, farmers, employers all learned that women could do the job. They're very capable and worked hard to prove it. Of course, we're still working harder to prove it, right? Yes.
I wonder, I grew up on the east side of Michigan in the Detroit area, and I do remember World War II and the rationing. And I don't know whether it was just a regional thing. Is anybody here remembering having to eat lard sandwiches and chicken feet?
Oh.
We know where those chickens have been. And then, of course, upgrade to pig's feet.
Yeah,
No.
I know. But desperate times, desperate measures, right? In fact, I think it was 2 years ago, I flew down in the B-25 bomber that's at the Michigan Flight Experience Yankee Air Museum. And I had Spam for the first time. I'd never had Spam in my life. No, no, it was okay. But
Okay. Just a minute.
yeah.
I see Betty Crocker and food brands. Did that have something big to do with Michigan or?
Well,
I mean, I don't-
right. I wrote a lot of articles for the American Rosie the Riveter Association. And so Betty Crocker was helping people during this time of rationing to create, good recipes. And then this whole Home Legion became popular. She started, Betty Crocker was a fictional character as well. It's not a real person, but they created this Home Legion to help women, both working women and women who stayed home to, do things the easiest way, the smartest way. And food brands also got into it. And I was just telling Fran, I have this advertisement that has Snap, Crackle, and Pop, and they're flying in bombers. Yeah, that everybody had to get on there and show that they were doing their patriotic duty, and they could do that. Well, if you buy my product, you're buying, you're being patriotic. And even the giveaways that you got in the cereal boxes. I have a cardboard bomber that you got if you bought that cereal, then you could put it together and play with your little bomber. So there's just, everybody was showing their patriotism. And that's why the scrap drives were so important, because everyone felt they were really contributing you know, to the youngest member of the family, you could do something. Oh, we have way back there.
Last week, we were at the 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia,
Oh.
and they've got a portion of a bomber that's got snack, crackle, and pop on it.
Do they? Yeah, they said that the original one, that it crashed, but that, the nose art was repeated by, afterwards. So the nose art was very popular, and it was named, whoever had the Enola Gay, we heard the press about the Enola Gay lately, it was named after his mother, that it was whoever flew, the pilot of that plane, the captain of that plane got to pick the name of it. But if it crashed, or unless you, bought a bomber and you were part, high schoolers and you got to name the plane. Yes.
Rosie, how did you get started in this whole Rosie the Riveter?
So many of
plant?
my co-tribute Rosies, they had grandmothers or mothers. Deb Shako that lives here in Holland, her mother was a Rosie for 1 week, and she switched machines with another Rosie. Her sweater got caught and she lost her arm. She had several brothers who all served, all came back unscathed, and she lost an arm. I got mine through my history, through the Henry Ford. Henry Ford was so involved in the war effort. Once it started, he was part of the America First and was opposed to the war along with Charles Lindbergh. And a lot of Americans were against the war, but once we entered the war, they dissolved and said, we all need to get behind the war effort and win this war. So yeah, it's just my love of history. Although, as I said, my former husband, his parents met at the Willow Run Bomber plant. So she was a Rosie and he was a supervisor, and there was no fraternizing, right? Yeah.
Another question here.
You've got so many things on
I
there.
know. Well, this is another whole presentation that I can come and talk about all these components because there's just so much going on.
Was there something specific about entertainment during World War II?
I just found it fascinating when you're talking about radio, for one, being so important for communications for the war, but then home, it gave us the news. It gave us the songs that gave us hope. Rosie the Riveter song. So that was so important. And then the movies, the movies gave us hope as well. It really, everything in the field of entertainment changed. And these actors who went out on war bond drives, several of them dying in plane crashes because they're traveling from city to city to raise money. But it's a fascinating aspect of it that I just found. Oh yeah, the USO. Yeah, they went over and entertained the troops. But
You didn't get much into Fafner bearing. My parents worked for that to make the ball bearings for the tanks.
okay,
And that was in Holland.
right. That's where Fana Dockery,
Yeah.
doctor
yeah.
worked.
Yeah.
Yeah. All I have read about is her. And then I've seen the newsletters from the company. So I know that they made the bearings, and they were actually they were located in the Hart and Cooley, or part of that factory off of 8th Street.
I'm not sure where they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm still researching, who worked over here, where they worked, what they did.
Yeah. But I think it was also an era that taught children independence and being responsible, because my parents are going off to the war factory. I'm 4 years old, 5 years old. I have to walk through the fields to the babysitter at least a half a mile away. And they
Mhm.
expected me to. They left me a boiled egg in the morning, which I promptly threw away on the way. But, you know, the children of that era, we had to really take on responsibility
Right.
also.
Right. My dad talked about how they rolled newspapers, and they would sell them to some company. He would go out, to the country, they'd get eggs and they'd have to inspect the eggs under a light to make sure they were good. They sold eggs. And my grandfather worked at Ford Motor. He ran an overhead crane in the steel mill. And if you look at the phone books, it says John Wake, Ford Motor hooker. So grandfather was a hooker. But yeah, you did everything between coming off of the Depression and then going into the war. I mean, that's why they're called the greatest generation.
Then also, a sad note, ended my parents' marriage because he could not go. My dad was exempt. And so he was working at Fafner Bearing also. Well, the women came on to him and my mother couldn't take it.
Oh,
so-
no.
Done deal with a marriage.
Yeah, so few men around, right?
I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Okay,
And just a block away was a huge WPA housing.
Right.
And it was probably built during this time that you're talking about when there was not very much housing. And one thing that fascinated me, I went over there all the time. They had a huge daycare center.
mhm,
And all of the people who lived in these WPA houses were low income. I mean, had concrete floors and
mhm.
flat roofs and
Yeah.
2 rooms.
And they're still around. There's a facility.
Oh, yeah.
WPA was the Works Progress or Works Administration. That was actually Depression era, but then they used them for war housing. I lived in Plymouth, Michigan, and the house I lived in, I actually just rented the top, 'cause it's downtown and I work for nonprofit. But they subdivided the house during World War II because a company or a division of the government went around and asked people who their children had grown and moved out if they would be willing to subdivide or let out part of their house. And my grandparents' house, they had a border. I said, how did they do that? They had 2 rooms and an attic, but you squeezed war workers in. And so there's a lot of that housing that, believe it or not, is still around. There's still people living in it. Because I know Westland has what we call Shack Town, and that was built.
Looks like we have a question on the chat.
Yes, Dave.
Any books you recommend about women on the home front during World War II?
My favorite is that A.J. Baim, Arsenal of Democracy. That is really about, it's more about the Detroit and Ford Motor and that, but it's really talks about statewide. I think it's wonderfully written. That's my favorite book.
Do you have another question or not? Okay, well. Okay, thumbs up. Okay, please help me thank Deborah
Okay. Thank you very much.
and stay tuned. It looks like we could have more Rosie the Riveter talks. And then when you leave, please push in your chairs to help
Oh, you
the
remembered.
next event.